Welcome, seekers of stories and echoes of the past. I'm your chronicler, and this is the place where history's forgotten, whispers are given a voice once more. Have you ever stood before a ruin, like the Colosseum, and felt more than just awe? Have you felt a faint, chilling echo of the screams, the roar of a crowd that saw death not as a tragedy, but as a spectacle? We think of horror as monsters under the bed or shadows in the dark, but the most profound terrors are often the ones we create ourselves in the broad, bright light of day, with thousands cheering us on. Today, we journey back to an age of unparalleled grandeur and unspeakable brutality. We will walk the blood-soaked sands of the arena and then descend even farther into a darkness the Romans themselves feared more than any barbarian horde, their own underworld. My question to you is this: which is the truer hell, the one we build on earth with stone and steel and human lives, or the one that waits for us in the eternal dark? As we embark on this epic journey, let me know your thoughts on that question in the comments below. Your engagement truly brings this channel to life. If you enjoy delving into the heart of these ancient horrors, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more tales from the annals of history. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss a descent into the past. Also, tell me, what eras or what kinds of stories do you want me to read next? Your suggestions shape our future travels. Now, settle in and let us begin. The sun over Rome was a merciless god. It beat down upon the marble and travertine of the Flavian amphitheater, baking the 80,000 souls packed within its elliptical embrace. It was a hammer of gold and heat, forging an atmosphere so thick with sweat, wine, dust, and the cloying, metallic tang of blood that to breathe was to taste the very essence of the city, power and decay. From his seat in the section reserved for the military, Centurion Cassius Longinus felt the heat not on his skin, but in his bones. It was a familiar heat, the same that had baked his legionary armor in the deserts of Syria and cooked the air in the fever swamps of Britannia. He was a man carved from the frontiers of the empire, his face a testament to 20 years of service, a map of sun wrinkles around his eyes, a thin white scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a jaw set with the permanence of a man who had given orders that cost lives and followed others that cost pieces of his soul. He was 38 years old, an age that on a civilian was the prime of life, but on a career soldier felt like the slow, creaking onset of twilight. He had returned to Rome 6 months prior on a mandatory leave, a reward for his distinguished service in the Dacian campaigns. They called it a reward, but to Cassius, it felt like an exile. The city was a beast he no longer understood. On the frontier, a man's worth was measured by the strength of his shield arm, the sharpness of his gladius, and the loyalty he commanded from the men in his century. Here, in the seething heart of the world, worth was measured in whispers, in the cut of a toga, in the favor of feckless senators and the decadent whims of an emperor who had never known a day of true hardship. Below him, the morning's Venetian, the beast hunts, had concluded. The sand of the arena floor, raked fresh only hours ago, was now a grisly canvas. Patches of dark, wet crimson soaked into the yellow grit, marking the places where lions from Africa and bears from the Caledonian forests had met their end. At the tip of a spear, the carcasses had been dragged away, the sand raked again by slaves, but the smell lingered. It always lingered. The crowd roared, a single, monstrous lung. The midday executions were about to begin. damnatio of bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Cassius's stomach, hardened by years of stale campaign rations and witnessing battlefield butchery, turned over. This was not war. This was not the grim necessity of combat. This was a perverse theater, a ritual of state-sanctioned savagery, designed to placate the mob and remind them of the emperor's absolute power over life and death. He had seen crucifixions lining the Appian Way, a gallery of human suffering left to rot for weeks. He had seen deserters flogged to death. He had seen things that would turn a civilian's hair white. But this methodical celebratory felt different. It was a sickness in the soul of the empire. A horn blew, a deep, resonant blast that silenced the crowd for a heartbeat. The great gates at the eastern end of the arena groaned open. A handful of figures, stripped to simple linen tunics, were herded onto the sand. They were criminals, deserters, and followers of forbidden Eastern cults. They blinked in the blinding sunlight, their bodies pale and frail against the vast, sun-drenched stage of their own demise. Cassius watched, his face an impassive mask. He had trained himself to be so. Emotion was a weakness a Centurion could not afford, but behind the mask, his mind was a tempest. He saw the faces of the condemned, their eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost divine. This was the cold horror, not the imagined monsters of children's tales, but this, the absolute certainty of a violent, painful, and public end. Another gate opened. A pack of starved wolves, their ribs stark beneath mangy fur, loped into the arena. They were hesitant at first, unused to the light and the noise. Then the scent of blood and fear reached them, and the primal instinct took over. The crowd erupted. Cassius closed his eyes. He did not need to see. The sounds were enough. The screams high and thin, cut short, the wet, tearing sounds. The triumphant roar of 80,000 Romans, their voices united in a chorus of bloodlust. He felt a hand on his shoulder.
A fine spectacle, is it not, Centurion?
Cassius opened his eyes. The man beside him was Tribune Claudius, a young officer of patrician birth. His face flushed with excitement, his eyes gleaming. He was everything Cassius despised about the new Rome. Soft, arrogant, and weaned on this casual brutality. "It is a spectacle," Cassius replied, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. Claudius laughed, mistaking the emptiness for military stoicism. "It reminds the plebs who is master, a necessary lesson." Cassius did not answer. He looked past the tribune, his gaze sweeping over the senators in their ivory chairs, the Vestals in their shaded box, a serene island of white in a sea of color. His eyes found one of them, and for a moment the sickness in his stomach subsided, replaced by a warmth that was both a comfort and an ache. Lyra. Her face was turned away from the arena, her posture rigid. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders. She, too, was disgusted by this. Lyra, who saw the divine in a wildflower on the Palatine Hill, who spoke of Vesta not as a distant goddess, but as a living, breathing warmth at the heart of every home. She was a vessel of peace in a city that worshipped violence. Their connection was a secret, a blasphemy that could see them both executed. He was a soldier, a man of Mars. She was a priestess of Vesta, sworn to 30 years of chastity. They had met by chance in the library of the Forum, their hands brushing as they both reached for the same scroll of poetry by Catullus. From that spark grew a clandestine love, conducted in stolen moments, whispered words in secluded gardens, and letters passed through a trusted servant. It was an impossible love, a fragile flame, cupped against the hurricane of Roman law and tradition, and it was the only thing that made this city bearable for him. He felt her presence like a beacon, a point of sanity in the madness. As the last of the condemned was silenced, and the slaves with their rakes and buckets of sand moved in once more, Cassius allowed himself a flicker of hope. In 2 years, his service would be complete. He would be a free citizen with a handsome pension. In 10 years, Lyra's service as a Vestal would end. She would be free to marry. It was a long, desperate hope, but it was his. The trumpet sounded again, signaling the main event, the Munera, the gladiatorial games. The crowd's roar reached a new, feverish pitch. But Cassius's attention was snagged by a sudden commotion near the senatorial seats. A small contingent of Praetorian guards, their plumed helmets and polished armor marking them as the emperor's personal force, had descended the steps. They were not moving towards the arena, but towards the box of the Vestal Virgins. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind in Dacia, washed over Cassius. It was a soldier's instinct, the same feeling that warned him of an ambush in a silent forest. He watched, his knuckles white, where he gripped the marble railing as the guards stopped before the Vestal's enclosure. Their leader, a grim-faced Decurion, exchanged words with the Vestalized Maxima, the head priestess. Then, to the utter astonishment of all who noticed, the guards entered the sacred box. The crowd's roar faltered, a confused murmur rippling through the stands. The sanctity of the Vestals was absolute. To lay a hand on one was a capital crime. Cassius saw them approach Lyra. He saw her stand, her white stola, a stark contrast to the Praetorians' gleaming bronze. He could not hear their words, but he could see her face, pale and confused, then etched with disbelief and horror. He saw the Decurion place a hand on her arm. A collective gasp went through the amphitheater. Cassius felt the world tilt. The heat, the noise, the smell, it all faded to a distant hum. His entire being was focused on that single, impossible tableau. The guards were leading her out, pulling her away from her sisters. His training, his discipline, the carefully constructed walls around his heart, they all crumbled to dust. He was on his feet, shoving past a bewildered Tribune Claudius. "What is happening?" he demanded, his voice a raw growl. Claudius looked shocked. "By the gods, they are arresting a Vestal. She must have broken her vow. Unchastity." The word struck Cassius like a physical blow. Unchastity. The punishment was legendary. A horror from the Republic's earliest days, to be buried alive. Who accuses her? Cassius's voice was dangerously low. Before Claudius could answer, a figure rose from the senatorial seats, positioning himself to be seen by the entire amphitheater. He was tall and imperious, his toga immaculately white, his face a mask of calculated piety and sorrow. Legate Gaius Valerius. Valerius had been Cassius's commanding officer in Dacia, a man whose ambition was a ravenous fire, who saw soldiers not as men, but as rungs on a ladder to power. He was cruel, cunning, and politically untouchable. Cassius had defied him once, refusing an order to slaughter a surrendered Dacian village. The refusal had saved hundreds of lives, but had earned him Valerius's eternal, simmering hatred. Valerius was the reason Cassius was on leave in Rome, effectively sidelined, While Valerius reaped the glory of their campaign, Valerius raised his hand for silence. His voice, amplified by the amphitheater's perfect acoustics, carried to every corner. People of Rome, it is with a heavy heart that I perform this grim duty. The sanctity of our city, the favor of the gods, rests upon the purity of Vesta's sacred fire and her chosen servants. A shadow has fallen upon this sacred order. The Vestal Lyra, daughter of the Decimus clan, has been found to have broken her holy vow of chastity. She has polluted the temple and endangered us all. A wave of outrage and fury swept the crowd. It was no longer the detached bloodlust of the games. This was personal, religious fear. A polluted Vestal could bring plague, famine, military defeat. The gods would abandon Rome. Cassius felt the blood drain from his face. It was a lie, a monstrous, impossible lie. Lyra was the soul of piety. Their love was one of minds and whispered words, of shared reverence for a world beyond the squalor of the city. It was chaste, a painful necessity he had honored for her sake, for both their sakes. The accusation was absurd, but he knew Valerius. He knew the man's serpentine cunning. This was not about justice. It was about power, and it was about revenge. Valerius had found the one way to destroy Cassius, to strike at the one thing the Centurion held sacred. He had lightly tortured her servant, fabricated evidence, bribed witnesses. The truth did not matter. The accusation was enough. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, was now conferring with the emperor. The process was swift, a mockery of a trial, the word of a legate like Valerius, a war hero in the public eye, against a lone woman. The outcome was preordained. Cassius's mind raced, a whirlwind of desperation. He had to get to her. He had to stop this. He was a centurion. He commanded 100 men who would die for him. But they were hundreds of miles away on the Danubian frontier. Here, he was one man against the Praetorian Guard, the Senate, the Emperor, and 80,000 Romans baying for blood. To act was to die. But to do nothing was a damnation worse than any hell. He watched in frozen horror as the Emperor gave a curt nod. The verdict was passed. The Pontifex Maximus stepped forward, his face grim, and began the ancient rite of condemnation. He stripped Lyra of her vitae, the sacred ribbons in her hair, and the suffibulum, her ceremonial veil. She stood before the city, shorn of her office, a mere woman awaiting a monstrous fate. Her eyes, wide with terror and a profound, heartbreaking betrayal, swept the crowd. They were searching. Cassius knew they were searching for him. He stood taller, trying to will her to see him, to let her know she was not alone. Their eyes met for a single, eternal second across the vast expanse of the amphitheater. Their gazes locked. He saw no accusation in her eyes, no blame. He saw only love and a silent, desperate plea, not for rescue. They both knew that was impossible, but for remembrance. Do not forget me. Then the guards pulled her away, dragging her towards the Porta Libertinaria, the gate of death, through which the dead gladiators were dragged. The day of the burying was a spectacle of a different sort. There was no cheering, no roar of a bloodthirsty crowd. A solemn, fearful silence gripped the city as Lyra was paraded through the forum. She was not in her pristine white stola, but in funereal robes, bound and gagged, for her cries were considered ill-omened. She was placed on a closed litter, as if she were already a corpse, and carried to the Campus Celeratus, the accursed field just inside the city walls. Cassius watched from the shadows of the Basilica Aemilia, a ghost in his own city. He wore a simple, dark tunic, his centurion's armor and sword left in his quarters. He was just a face in the crowd, his features tight with a grief so vast it felt like a physical pressure inside his skull. He had not slept, he had not eaten, he had only watched and planned and felt the hate for Valerius solidify into a cold, hard thing in his chest. He followed the procession, keeping to the edges of the crowd. He saw Legate Valerius walking with the priests, his face a perfect mask of solemn duty. The man was a master actor. He had not only murdered Lyra, but had turned her death into a political triumph, positioning himself as the stern guardian of Roman tradition. At the accursed field, a subterranean vault had been prepared. It was a small, stone-lined chamber, just large enough for a person to sit. Inside, the priests had placed a couch, a lamp, and a meager portion of bread and water. It was a grotesque piety, a pretense that they were not killing her directly, but that she would simply be abandoned by the gods in her sealed tomb. They brought her to the edge of the pit. The Pontifex Maximus raised his hands to the sky and uttered the final prayers, absolving the city of the guilt of her death. Cassius could not hear the words. All he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heart. Lyra's eyes were wide above the gag. They darted over the faces of the priests, the guards, the silent onlookers. They were the eyes of a trapped animal, a desperate final search for an escape that did not exist. Then the executioners, their faces veiled, forced her down the ladder into the darkness. A moment later, the ladder was pulled up. Masons in the employ of the Pontifical College moved forward with bricks and mortar. The sound of the trowels scraping mortar, of bricks being laid one by one, was the sound of the world ending. Each brick was a shovel of dirt on his soul. The crowd watched in grim silence, their fear palpable. They believed they were sealing away a source of divine pollution, securing their own safety. Cassius saw only the entombment of everything he had ever loved. He saw the systematic, ritualized cruelty of the state he had served his entire life. The law, the order, the Pax Romana, it was all a lie, a gilded cage built on a foundation of such horrors. When the last brick was in place, and the masons had smoothed the mortar over, the Pontifex declared the rite complete. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring in low tones, eager to get back to their homes, to wash away the taint of the ceremony. Cassius remained, hidden in the shade of a cypress grove. He stayed as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky. He stayed as darkness fell and the stars emerged, cold and distant. He stood vigil over her living grave, a lone soldier at his final, hopeless post. In the dead of night, he approached the sealed wall. He pressed his palm against the still damp mortar. It was cool to the touch. He closed his eyes, trying to picture her in the blackness on the other side. Was she screaming? Was she praying? Was the lamp still lit? How long would the air last? Leah, he whispered, his voice cracking. The name was a shard of glass in his throat. There was no answer but the sighing of the wind through the cypress trees. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of the tomb, the silence of a world without her in it. He stayed until the first hint of dawn, a gray sickness in the eastern sky, a resolve born of utter despair and boundless rage had taken root in his soul. Rome had taken her from him in the world of the living. Valerius had used the laws of men and gods to commit the perfect murder, But what if there were other laws, other older realms? He had spent his life as a practical man, a soldier who believed in the strength of his shield and the edge of his sword. He scoffed at provincial superstitions and the whispers of magic on the frontiers. But he had also listened to the legionary tales, the stories told around campfires on long, cold nights, stories of shades and spirits, of gateways to the underworld, of heroes like Orpheus and Aeneas, who had journeyed into the land of the dead. They were myths, fables, but what if they weren't? What if the underworld, Dis, Orcus, Hades, whatever name one gave it, was a real place? A place with its own geography, its own rules, its own king. If Lyra's soul, innocent and pure, was now bound for that kingdom, then he would follow. He would trade his sword for a sorcerer's charm, his legionary eagle for a guide's map. He would walk into the heart of terror itself, not for vengeance against the dead, but for the salvation of one's soul. Vengeance against Valerius would come later, in the world of men. That would be simple, brutal, but simple. This other quest, this descent into madness, was for her. The sun rose higher, casting the long shadow of the city walls across the accursed field. Cassius turned his back on the tomb, his face set like stone. His grief had not lessened, but it had been forged into a purpose. He was no longer Cassius Longinus, Centurion of the 3rd Legion. He was a man with a singular, impossible mission. He would go to the end of the world and beyond. He would challenge the gods of the dead. He would bring her back. To challenge the gods, one first had to find them. The myths were maddeningly vague, filled with poetic license and contradictory geography. The underworld was everywhere and nowhere. Its entrances were guarded by monsters hidden in sacred groves or submerged at the bottom of foul lakes. A man could not simply walk there. Cassius knew he needed a guide, not a philosopher or a poet, but someone who dealt in the forbidden, the arcane. His mind turned to the whispers he'd once dismissed as barracks gossip. Talk of the Sibyls, ancient prophetesses whose knowledge stretched back before the founding of Rome. Most were gone, their sacred sites dormant, but legend held that one remained. Not in the sun-drenched hills of Cumae, but in the sprawling, chaotic squalor of the Suburra, Rome's grimy, overcrowded underbelly. Disguised in a hooded cloak, Cassius navigated the maze of narrow, stinking alleys. Here, the grandeur of Rome was a distant dream. The air was thick with the smells of charcoal, cheap wine, frying fish, and human waste. Tenements, the infamous insulae, leaned against each other, blotting out the sun. This was a different kind of darkness, a mortal one, but a darkness nonetheless. He found her in a cramped room, above a dye-maker's shop, the acrid smell of the vats below burning his nostrils. The Sibyl was ancient, a woman so old, her skin seemed like a parchment map of a forgotten land. Her eyes, however, were shockingly alive, 2 chips of obsidian that seemed to see not his cloaked disguise, but the raw, gaping wound of his soul. She sat, surrounded by bundles of dried herbs, strange charts of the stars, and scrolls of yellowed papyrus. "You are late, Centurion," she rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. She did not look up. From the knuckle bones she was casting onto a small wooden table, the girl's spirit is already on its journey. Cassius froze, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the Poggio dagger hidden in his belt. "How do you know who I am?" The Sibyl chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The stench of grief and vengeance is a miasma around you. It is stronger than the dyer's fumes. And I see the eagle standard in your heart, even if you have hidden its metal in your barracks. You seek a door that was locked by the Titans. You wish to walk where the living are not welcome. Can it be done? Cassius's voice was hoarse. He was a man of action, of direct orders and simple truths. This world of smoke and portents set him on edge. But he was desperate. He was on his knee. Everything can be done, the Sibyl said, finally looking at him. Her gaze was unnervingly direct. For a price. The gods of the below are jealous. They do not give, they only take. To ask for a soul is a great impertinence. It invites a terrible bargain. I will pay any price. So say all who come to me, she sighed, a flicker of something ancient and weary in her eyes. But you have the will, the soldier's will. You think in straight lines of objectives and victories. The underworld is not a battlefield to be conquered. It is a labyrinth of sorrow. It will try to unmake you, not with swords, but with despair. She gestured for him to come closer. He knelt before her, the floorboards gritty beneath his knees. The gate you seek is not in the warm lands of Italy, she whispered, her voice dropping conspiratorially. The veil between worlds has grown thick here, worn smooth by the tread of too many men. You must go north, to the edge of the empire, to the lands of snow and endless night. Dacia? Cassius breathed, a chill running down his spine. The land he had just left. Further, north of the Danubius, into the great white forests the locals call the Badurataseri, the forest of silence. It is a place where the sun is a winter stranger and the snow lies deep, a shroud over the sleeping earth. Mortals fear this place, and so their world has a weaker grip on it. In the heart of that forest, there is a cave, a fissure in the rock that breathes the cold of the grave. Even in summer, during a blizzard, on a night of the new moon, when the barrier is at its thinnest, that cave becomes a gateway. It is the Maw of Zarmoxis to the locals, but it is a path to the realm of Dis all the same. The golden bough, Cassius whispered, recognizing it from Virgil's epic. A piece of it, the Sibyl corrected. A cutting from the great tree. It will not make you invisible or grant you strength, but it is a passport. It is currency. It marks you as one on a sacred, if foolish, quest. The guardians of the threshold will recognize its authority. Charon will take you across the river. It may even soothe the great hound, but it will not protect you from the true dangers of that place. The despair of the fields of mourning, the horrors of Tartarus, or the judgment of King Dis and his terrible queen. She pressed the bough into his hand. It was cold to the touch, yet it sent a strange warmth up his arm. This is my price, the Sibyl said, her obsidian eyes locking onto his. When you return, if you return, you will owe me a favor. I will not tell you what it is. I will call upon you when the time is right, and you will not refuse, no matter the task. Cassius looked at the glowing leaf in his hand, then back at her. I accept. One last thing, Centurion, she said, as he stood to leave. You go to retrieve a soul of perfect innocence. The underworld is a place of justice, of a kind. The innocent rest in the Elysian fields, a paradise of peace. Why would she want to leave? Why would you want to take her from a heaven to put her back in this hell? The question struck him. He had been so consumed with his own loss, his own need to have her back, that he had not considered her fate. If she was at peace, what right did he have to disturb it? I must see her, he stammered, the soldier's certainty wavering for the first time. I must know that she is safe, and I must tell her. I must tell her I am sorry. The Sibyl nodded slowly. Atonement, a dangerous reason to haunt the dead. Go now. The winter's snows will not wait for your grief, and be warned, the underworld changes those who walk its paths. The man who returns will not be the man who left. Cassius left the Sibyl's chamber, the golden bough hidden in his tunic, its strange warmth a secret comfort against his skin. The problem was clear, the challenge immense, the path laid out before him. He was to become a fugitive, a wanderer, a seeker of myth. He was to journey into a frozen, snowy hell, armed with nothing but his grief, his rage, and a single glowing leaf. The journey north was a systematic dismantling of the man Cassius Longinus had been. He shed his identity as a centurion layer by layer, like a snake, shedding its skin. First went the armor, the crested helmet, the military sandals, and the scarlet cloak. He traded them in a dusty border town for rough-spun wool, a heavy fur-lined traveling cloak, and stout leather boots, the anonymous garb of a merchant or a migrant farmer. He kept only two things from his former life: the gladius, its familiar weight, a grim comfort at his side, and the Prugio dagger, a weapon of last resort. And one thing from his new life, the golden bow, wrapped in linen and hidden close to his heart, its unnatural warmth, a constant, secret reminder of his insane purpose. His journey through Italy was a lesson in shadows. He, who had always marched proudly down the center of Roman roads, now skulked in the ditches and woods that lined them. He saw the empire not from the elevated position of an enforcer of its will, but from the perspective of the forgotten and the downtrodden. He saw farmers whose lands were slowly being choked out by the vast latifundia of absentee senators, their faces etched with a quiet desperation. He now understood. He saw runaway slaves hiding in the marshes, their eyes filled with a terror that mirrored his own. He saw the arrogance of the local magistrates, the casual cruelty of the tax collectors, and the weary cynicism of the people. This was the foundation upon which the gleaming marble of Rome rested, a substructure of quiet suffering. He felt no loyalty to it anymore, only a cold, burning contempt. It was Valerius's world, and Cassius was now a ghost haunting its edges. He avoided the legions. More than once, he pressed himself into a thorny thicket or a half-frozen ditch as a patrol trotted past, their armor jingling, their laughter and barrack room jokes carrying on the cold air. He knew their cadence, the rhythm of their march, the slang they used. He could have been one of them. The thought brought a pang of loss, so sharp it was like a physical wound. But it was followed by a wave of revulsion. They were cogs in the machine that had murdered Lyra. They were his brothers, no longer. Crossing the Alps in the grip of early winter was the first great test. The world became vertical, a realm of stone, winged and blinding white. He joined a small caravan of traders for protection, men who plied the dangerous mountain passes to bring amber and furs south. They were hard, taciturn men who asked few questions and respected a man who could handle a sword and his share of the work. For weeks, they trudged through treacherous, snow-choked paths, the air so thin and cold it felt like swallowing needles. At night, huddled around a meager fire in a wind-scoured shelter, the world reduced to the flickering orange light and the howling darkness beyond. Cassius felt the true weight of his isolation. He would stare into the flames and see Lyra's face, not as she was in the Colosseum or at her tomb, but as she was in the quiet garden on the Palatine Hill, her head tilted, a smile playing on her lips as she listened to him describe the strange, savage beauty of the lands he had seen. The memory was a torment, a warmth that made the cold around him feel even more absolute. One night, a blizzard of terrifying ferocity descended upon them. They were caught on an exposed ridge. The wind, a physical force, that threatened to tear them from the mountainside. The lead mule, blinded by the swirling snow, lost its footing and plunged into the abyss, its scream swallowed by the storm. In the chaos, Cassius's training took over. He organized the panicked men, secured the remaining pack animals, and guided them to the relative safety of a rock overhang. He was the Centurion again. For a few brief, desperate hours, when the storm passed and the sun rose on a world of pristine, lethal beauty, the traders looked at him with a new respect. The leader, a gray-bearded man named Gisco, shared a piece of his precious dried meat with him. "You are no merchant," Gisco said, his eyes shrewd. "You have the bearing of a soldier, a good one, running from something, running towards something." Cassius replied, his voice flat. Gisco grunted, accepting the non-answer. A man's past is his own burden. But a word of advice: north of the great river, the Danubius, the only thing that matters is this. He tapped his temple. And this, he pointed to the sky. The old gods are strong there. The land remembers them. Be careful what you go looking for. You may find it. They parted ways in a small Roman fort on the southern bank of the Danubius. The river was a vast, gray, churning expanse, choked with slabs of ice. This was the Limes, the hard frontier of the empire. Watchtowers studded the bank, and the smoke of legionary camps smudged the horizon. This was his old world. He had commanded a cohort in a fort just like this one, 100 miles downriver. To be here, as a fugitive, was surreal. He felt the pull of his old life, the desire for the simple order of the barracks, the camaraderie of the mess hall. It was a siren song, promising a return to a life that no longer existed for him. He spent 2 days watching the river, studying the patrols of the classis Pannonica, the Roman river fleet. Crossing here was impossible. He traveled west along the riverbank into the wilder, less patrolled territory, where the forests grew thick down to the water's edge. There, he found a lone fisherman, a Dacian who had been granted land on the Roman side for his service as an auxiliary scout. The man was old, his face a web of wrinkles, his eyes holding the patient wisdom of one who understood the river's moods. Cassius did not try to lie. He offered the man a handful of silver denarii. "I need to cross," he said simply. "Tonight, no questions." The old Dacian looked at the coins, then at Cassius's face. He saw the grief and the hard resolve there. He had seen it before, in men fleeing blood feuds, or debts, or the long arm of Roman law. He spat on the ground. "The river is angry," the fisherman said, in heavily accented Latin. "She takes a toll in winter, not just silver." He gestured to Cassius's gladius. "You carry a Roman sword. The men on the other side will not welcome you." "I am not going there as a Roman," Cassius said. The Dacian seemed to understand. He nodded slowly. "The spirits of the forest do not care for eagles or wolves. They care for respect and blood. Be there an hour after moonrise. Bring another coin for the river god, or she will swallow my boat." Cassius was alone. Truly alone. He had crossed the threshold. He stood for a long moment, looking back at the faint lights of the Roman watchtowers on the southern bank. They seemed a world away. He was now in Barbaricum, the untamed lands. He turned his back on the river and on the empire and walked into the forest. The world on the north bank was different. The air was colder, purer. The forests were older, denser. The trees, immense titans of oak and pine draped in heavy shawls of snow. The silence was profound. In the Roman lands, even in the wilderness, there was always the distant sound of civilization. A woodcutter's axe, a dog's bark, the rumble of a cart. Here, there was nothing Only the sigh of the wind in the high branches and the soft crunch of his own boots in the deep snow. It was the silence of a world that had never been tamed, that had never bent its knee to man. For weeks he journeyed north, guided by the sun and stars and the Sibyl's cryptic directions. He was no longer soldier or fugitive. He was a hunter. He set snares for rabbits, speared fish in frozen streams, and once, with a carefully aimed throw of his Pugio, brought down a young deer. He ate the meat raw and bloody, the warmth of it, a primal comfort in his frozen guts. He learned the language of the forest, which snow-covered mounds hid fallen logs for shelter, which barks were good for tinder, how to read the tracks of wolves and avoid their paths. He became gaunt, his face covered in a ragged beard, his eyes sunken but sharp, constantly scanning, listening. The grief for Lyra was still there, a hard, cold stone in his chest, but it was now overlaid with the constant, immediate demands of survival. He encountered people only twice. The first was a war party of mounted bastinae, their faces painted with blue woad, their long hair braided with bone. They saw him before he saw them, materializing from the snow-draped trees like ghosts. He stood his ground, his hand not on his sword, but held open, a sign of peace. They circled him, their spears leveled, their expressions a mixture of contempt and curiosity. A lone Roman, this deep in their territory, they spoke to him in a guttural tongue. He did not understand. He simply pointed north. Zalnaxis, he said, using the name the fisherman had spoken. It was the only word he knew. The warriors exchanged glances. The name held power. The leader, a giant of a man with a scarred face, grunted and gestured with his spear. Also to the north, it was not a friendly gesture. It was a dismissal, a warning. Go to your strange god. Die in the snow. You are not worth the effort of a spear thrust. They wheeled their horses and vanished as silently as they had appeared. The second encounter was with an old woman, a hermit, living in a hovel made of mud and wood, built into the side of a hill. A thin plume of smoke from her chimney was the only reason he found her. He was near starvation, a fever from the relentless cold clouding his mind. He stumbled to her door, half expecting to be met with a knife. She opened the door and simply looked at him, her eyes as dark and ancient as the forest itself. She saw not a Roman, but a man on the edge of death. Without a word, she helped him inside, into the smoky warmth of her single-room home. She gave him a bowl of hot, bitter-tasting broth and a piece of hard black bread. She spoke a dialect of the local Dacian tongue, and to his surprise, he understood some of it. It was similar to the tongue of the auxiliaries he had commanded. He told her, in broken phrases, that he was looking for the Padorea Tatseri. The old woman's face, already a mask of wrinkles, seemed to collapse inward. Fear flickered in her eyes. She made a sign against evil. Padorea Tatseri, she whispered. The silent forest, the place where the trees have no tongues and the animals have no heartbeats. It is a cursed place, a gateway. The maw of Zalmoxis swallows the living. She looked at him closely. You have the death mark on you, stranger. You seek the world below. I seek someone who was taken from me, Cassius said. The old woman nodded, a deep, sorrowful understanding in her eyes. Love, the only madness stronger than the fear of the gods. She let him rest by her fire for a day and a night. When he was strong enough to leave, she gave him a small pouch of dried mushrooms. Eat these only if you lose your way, she warned. They will show you the path you are meant to be on, but the path is not always the one you wish to travel. Following her directions, he finally found it. The transition was unmistakable. The forest he had been traveling through, ancient as it was still a living thing. But then he crossed an unseen boundary. The character of the woods changed. The trees became black, gnarled, and skeletal. Their branches twisted into agonized shapes. The snow here was deeper, purer, and seemed to swallow all sound. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, oppressive blanket. He could hear the thumping of his own heart, the rasp of his own breath. This was the Poderia Tatseri. He searched for 3 days in this unnatural quiet. The cold was more intense here, a psychic cold that seemed to drain the warmth from his very soul. He felt constantly watched. He would whip his head around, sword drawn, to find nothing but silent, snow-laden trees. The grief for Lyra, held at bay by the necessities of survival, returned with overwhelming force. In the crushing silence, her absence was a deafening scream. He saw her face in the patterns of the bark, heard her whisper on the non-existent wind. He felt his sanity fraying at the edges. On the 3rd day, as the sun began its low, brief arc across the winter sky, he found it, a sheer cliff face of black rock rising from the snowy forest floor like a rotten tooth, and in its center, a fissure, a dark, vertical slit, no taller than a man. It was exactly as the Sibyl had described. From it emanated a palpable aura of cold, a draught that was not of the air, but of the grave. This was the maw. He made his camp in a small hollow, within sight of the cave. He had to wait. The Sibyl's words echoed in his mind. During a blizzard, on a night of the new moon, he checked the sky. Each night, the moon was waning, a shrinking sliver of silver in the ink-black sky. He had days to wait. The vigil was the hardest part of the journey. There was nothing to do but wait and think and remember. He was assailed by doubt. What was he doing here? Chasing a myth into a frozen wasteland? What if the Sibyl was a madwoman? What if the cave was just a cave? What if he died here, a frozen, forgotten fool? His quest a final, pathetic delusion. He thought of Valerius, back in Rome, likely enjoying a lavish dinner, surrounded by sycophants. His crime not only successful, but rewarded. The rage that thought produced was a fire that kept the despair at bay. Whether this path led to Lyra, or just to his own death, it was a path of defiance. It was a rejection of Valerius's world and its cruel, empty goal. The night of the new moon arrived. The sky was a starless, hopeless black, and the air grew still, terribly still. The temperature plummeted. Then the first snowflake drifted down, then another. Within minutes, the air was a blinding, swirling vortex of white, a blizzard, just as the Sibyl had foretold. The wind shrieked through the skeletal trees, a chorus of damned souls. Cassius pulled his cloak tight, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. He took the linen-wrapped packet from his tunic, his fingers numb with cold. Fumbled with the cloth, he unwrapped the golden bough. In the heart of the raging blizzard, it shone. It did not reflect light. It created it. A soft, gentle, golden luminescence that pushed back the darkness and the swirling snow in a small, calm circle around him. It was real. The Sibyl had not lied. He walked towards the maw. The bough held before him like a lantern. The unnatural cold pouring from the fissure intensified, a physical force that pushed against him. He reached the entrance and peered in. It was no longer just a fissure in the rock. The darkness within seemed to be moving, warping, The edges of the cave shimmered like air over a hot fire, except it was a fire of absolute cold. He was looking at a tear in the fabric of the world. It was a sight his soldier's mind could not process, a violation of all known laws of nature. It was terror and wonder. He thought of Lyra, of her smile, of her hand in his. He thought of her screams, sealed behind a wall of brick and mortar. He thought of his promise to himself at her living grave, with the golden bough held high, its light casting his long, determined shadow against the raging storm. Cassius Londinus took a deep breath of the freezing air of the living world and stepped across the threshold into the silent kingdom of the dead. The transition was not a step, but a fall. The moment Cassius was fully inside the mall, the physical reality of the world vanished. There was no ground, no air, no up or down. He was adrift in a cold, silent, and absolute blackness. A void that was not merely the absence of light, but a presence in itself. The blizzard, the forest, the very memory of a physical body seemed to be stripped away. All that existed was his consciousness, a single point of terrified awareness, and the warm, steady glow of the golden bough clutched in a hand he could no longer feel. The whispers began then. They were not sounds that entered his ears, but thoughts that bloomed unbidden in his mind. They were the voices of every doubt he had ever had, every fear he had ever suppressed. You are a fool. You are a murderer. You abandoned your men. You failed her. She is dead because of you. Your grief is selfish. Turn back. You are not worthy. The voices were insidious, weaving his own insecurities into a tapestry of despair. The soldier in him fought back, imposing the brutal discipline of the Legion upon his own mind. He focused on a single image, Lyra's eyes, locking with his across the Colosseum. He made her memory his shield. Slowly, as if his will was pulling the pieces of reality back together, a world began to coalesce around him. A grey, featureless ground formed beneath his feet. The void resolved into a sky of permanent, starless twilight. The air was cold, still, and smelled of damp earth and old stone. He stood on the bank of a vast, slow-moving river. Its water was not water, but a thick, black, oily substance that absorbed all light. The river Acheron, the river of woe. He had arrived. The landscape of the anti-inferno was a monochrome nightmare. The ground was a featureless plain of grey ash and mud, stretching to a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. Throngs of shades, innumerable as the leaves of autumn, crowded the riverbank. They were translucent, flickering things, their forms indistinct, their faces etched with a perpetual, silent longing. These were the unburied dead, doomed to wander the banks for 100 years before they could cross. They reached out to him as he passed, their touch feeling like a wisp of cold smoke, their silent mouths forming pleas he could not hear. They were drawn to the warmth of his living blood and the light of the golden bough, like moths to a dying flame. Cassius clutched the bough tighter, its holy light keeping the most desperate of the shades at bay, and walked on, his heart a cold lump of pity and dread. This was the fate he had saved Lyra from by providing a tomb, an act of mercy he hadn't even understood at the time. He followed the riverbank till he saw a rickety wooden ferry pulled up on the shore. Standing in it was a figure of filth and menace, Charon, the ferryman of the dead. He was not merely an old man. He was an elemental being of decay. His beard was a matted, tangled mess. His eyes burned with a malevolent, greedy fire, and his tunic was stiff with the grime of ages. He pulled the ferry with a brutal, relentless rhythm, his gnarled arms corded with supernatural strength. Charon's fiery eyes fixed on Cassius. A guttural roar erupted from his throat, a sound like grinding stones. Hold! No living flesh crosses this river. This is the domain of shadows and sleep. Turn back before I add your corpse to my cargo. The shades around Cassius recoiled from the ferryman's fury, but Cassius stood his ground. He held up the golden bow. Its light flared, a soft, undeniable gold against the oppressive grey of the underworld. Charon's angry roar died in his throat. His fiery eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a grudging, resentful respect. He recognized the sacred passport, the fatal branch. He rasped, his voice a low growl. So be it. A hero's errand, or a fool's. It matters little to me. The fare is paid. He gestured with his chin towards the boat. Cassius stepped aboard, the ancient wood groaning under his living weight. As Charon pushed off from the bank, the shades let out a collective, silent sigh of despair. Watching them go, the crossing was silent. The black water of the Acheron did not lap or ripple. It slid past the boat like oil. Cassius looked down and saw faces in its depths, tormented, screaming faces, swirling just beneath the surface. He looked away, his stomach churning, and focused on the far bank, which was wreathed in a thick, clinging mist. As they neared the other side, a sound began to cut through the fog. It was a low, deep, guttural growl that vibrated in Cassius's bones. It grew louder, resolving into 3 distinct, overlapping snarls, a terrifying canine chorus. The ferry scraped ashore. Standing before the gates of Dis, a colossal, shadowy archway, was the guardian, Cerberus. The Hound of Hell was a monster beyond mortal comprehension. He was the size of a war elephant, with 3 heads, each one a mass of muscle and slavering jaws. A mane of writhing, hissing snakes coiled around his necks, and in 6 eyes glowed with a feral, mindless hunger. He was the embodiment of ravenous, untamable violence. At the sight of Cassius, a living, breathing creature, Cerberus went into a frenzy. The 3 heads roared as one, a sound that shook the very foundations of the underworld. The snake mane hissed, and venom dripped from his fangs, sizzling as it hit the ashen ground. This was a beast that could not be fought with a gladius. This was primal terror, given form. Cassius felt his courage, forged in 20 years of battle, falter. He was a gnat before a titan. He remembered the Sibyl's words. It may soothe the great hound. He held the golden bow forward, its light flaring. The 3 heads of Cerberus flinched, momentarily blinded. The roaring subsided into confused, angry whimpers. The beast was perplexed by the sacred object. It recognized the authority, but was driven by an instinct to attack the living intruder. While the hound was distracted, Cassius reached into a pouch at his belt. It was not a weapon. During his journey, remembering the tales of the Sibyl of Cumae, guiding Aeneas, he had prepared. He had mixed honey with a potent sleeping draught he had bartered for in a border town. He tossed the honeyed cake towards the beast. One of the heads, the most aggressive, snapped it out of the air. The other 2 heads snarled, jealous. The first head gulped the cake down. Then a strange, glazed look came into its 6 eyes. Its snarling softened. Its massive head drooped. Within moments, the first head was asleep, its chin resting on the ground with a soft thud. The other 2 heads whined, confused by their brother's sudden slumber. Then A wave of magical drowsiness seemed to overcome the entire creature. The remaining heads yawned, revealing caverns of razor-sharp teeth. And slowly, the great beast slumped to the ground, its thunderous snores replacing its terrifying growls. Breathing heavily, his body slick with cold sweat, Cassius skirted the sleeping monster and passed through the great, dark gates of doors. He was now in the true kingdom of the dead. The first region he passed through was the fields of mourning. Here, under groves of weeping, grey-leafed myrtles, wandered the souls of those who had died for love. They did not speak, but their sorrow was a tangible force, a psychic weight that pressed down on Cassius, threatening to drown him in his own grief. He saw legendary figures from myth, Dido of Carthage, her face a mask of eternal betrayal. Phaedra, Procris, they drifted through the spectral woods, forever lost in the memory of their fatal passion. The urge to stay, to lie down among them, and surrender to his own sorrow, for Lyra, was almost overwhelming. It was a siren's call of despair, more dangerous than Cerberus's fangs. He forced himself to walk on, his jaw clenched, his own grief a fresh, raw wound in this place of ancient heartbreaks. Lyra would not be here. Her love was not a sickness that led to death, but a light that had illuminated his life. He passed the fields of the war heroes, where the shades of great warriors endlessly reenacted their final battle. He saw Greeks and Trojans, Gauls and Persians, their ghostly forms clashing without sound or impact. He saw Romans too, centurions and legionaries he might have known, their faces grim, their phantom gladi swinging at ethereal foe. He looked for no one and hurried past, for this place celebrated the death he had come to despise. At last, he came to a great fork in the road. To the left, a broad path led down into a fiery chasm, from which came the sounds of screams, the crack of whips, and the roar of infernal machinery. A massive fortress with walls of solid iron stood over this path, a river of fire, the phlegethons circling it like a moat. This was the way to Tartarus, the prison of the damned. To the right, the path led towards a grove of poplar trees, from which came the faint, beautiful sound of music and a soft, golden light. This was the way to Elysium, the paradise of the blessed. Standing at the crossroads, as if awaiting him, was a figure of terrible majesty. He was tall and regal, but his face was obscured by shadow. He was not a shade, but a solid divine presence. It was Minos, the first of the great judges of the dead. Cassius Longinus, the judge said. His voice was not a sound, but a judgment that resonated in Cassius's soul, laying it bare. You have come far, farther than any mortal since the singer Orpheus. Your crime is great. The living do not belong in the kingdom of the dead. I have come for Lyra, Cassius said, his voice steady despite the terror coiling in his gut. A Vestal, wrongly condemned. She is innocent. Innocence is judged here, not in the flawed courts of men, Minos replied, his voice echoing with the weight of eternity. Her soul has been weighed. She is indeed blameless. But that is not the question before this court. The question is of you. Your heart is filled with rage, with a lust for vengeance against the man Valerius. You seek to defy the order of the cosmos, to reverse a death that has already been recorded in the books of fate. Why should you be allowed to proceed? This was the true trial, not of strength, but of motive. Cassius looked towards the fiery maw of Tartarus and felt the pull of his own hatred. He wanted Valerius to be there, to suffer for what he had done. He wanted to be the one to send him there. But that was not why he had come on this journey. Vengeance was for the living world. This was about something else. My rage against Valerius is my own, Cassius said, choosing his words carefully. I will settle that debt in the world of the sun, by the laws of men or the edge of my sword. I have come here not for vengeance, but for love and for atonement. Her death was the consequence of my enmity with him. She was the innocent sacrifice in a war between us. If I leave her here, my soul will find no peace in life and no rest in death. I will be one of those shades wandering the fields of mourning for eternity, a victim of my own destructive pride. He spoke with the simple, brutal honesty of a soldier who has seen the futility of lies in the face of death. He was not trying to be eloquent or clever. He was simply stating the truth of his own damned soul. Minos was silent for a long moment. The shadowy judge seemed to be weighing his words, not against a set of laws, but against the fundamental truth of the universe. The path of love is the path of sorrow, Minos said at last, and atonement is a heavier burden than any stone in Tartarus. Very well. Your motive is pure in its own selfish way. You do not seek to aggrandize yourself, but to mend a tear in your own spirit. A futile quest, but one that the gods below occasionally permit, if only for the tragedy it provides. He gestured with a shadowy hand towards the right-hand path. Her soul awaits its final disposition. It has been judged worthy of Elysium, but it has not yet drunk from the waters of Lee, the river of forgetfulness. Her memory of you and of her life is still intact. Go to her, but know this silent king and his queen, Persephone, will have the final say. They do not suffer insult lightly. The great judge faded back into the shadows, and Cassius was left alone at the crossroads. He had passed the trial. He turned towards the golden light of Elysium, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. He was about to see her. The key moment of his entire existence was upon him. He walked into the Elysian fields, and the oppressive gloom of the underworld fell away. Here, the ashen ground gave way to soft green meadows. The air was warm and smelled of strange, fragrant blossoms. A gentle, golden light, emanating from no sun, bathed the landscape. The shades here were different. They were not translucent and sorrowful, but solid and vibrant, glowing with a soft inner light. They were the souls of the just, the good, and the heroic. They spent their eternity in peaceful pursuits, composing poetry, discussing philosophy, engaging in athletic contests. Music drifted on the gentle breeze, ethereal and beautiful. It was paradise. He searched the peaceful groves and smiling fields, a frantic, desperate figure in this realm of perfect contentment. And then he saw her. She was sitting by a small, crystal-clear stream, under a silver-leafed poplar tree. She was weaving a garland of otherworldly flowers. She wore a simple white peplos, and her face was calm. The terror and betrayal he had last seen on it were gone, replaced by a profound, untroubled serenity. She was more beautiful than he had ever seen her. Lyra, he breathed. The name was a prayer. She looked up. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. A flicker of her mortal life, of the world she had left, returned to her face. Cassius, she whispered, her voice a melody he thought he would never hear again. He ran to her, falling to his knees in the soft grass before her. He reached out to touch her, but his hand stopped, hovering in the air. He was a creature of blood and dirt and violence, a walking vessel of rage and grief. He felt unworthy to touch her in her state of grace. "It is you," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "How? This is not a place for the living." "I came for you," he said, his own voice thick with unshed tears. "Lyra, I am so sorry. What happened? It was my fault. Valerius. He did it to hurt me. You were caught in my wall." She looked at him, and there was no blame in her eyes, only a deep, sorrowful compassion. "It was not your fault, Cassius. It was his. It was the fault of a world that mistakes cruelty for strength." She reached out and, for the first time, her spirit hand touched his living flesh. Her touch was cool and gentle, like a soft breeze. "You came all this way. You braved the darkness. For me, I would have torn down the gates of Olympus," he said, his voice raw. "I came to bring you back." It was then that her expression changed. The joy and wonder at seeing him were tempered by a new, deep sadness. She looked around at the peaceful fields of Elysium, at the contented souls wandering in the golden light. "Bring me back," she said softly. "Back to what, Cassius?" "To a world that buries its daughters alive, for sport, to a city that cheers for death. Here, there is no pain, there is no fear, there is only peace. The music is eternal, and the fields are always green." His heart, which had soared with the hope of reunion, shattered. Sybil's question returned to him with crushing force. Why would you want to take her from a heaven to put her back in this hell? He had been so consumed by his own loss, his own need to undo what had been done, that he had never truly considered what she would want. He looked into her serene face and saw the truth. She was at peace. She was home. "I can't leave you here," he stammered, the selfish desperation of his love laid bare. "And I cannot go back," she replied gently, but with a firmness that was as absolute as the judgment of Minos. "My suffering is over, Cassius. Do not ask me to begin it anew. Your quest was not to rescue me from this place. It was to find peace for yourself, to see that my soul was not in torment." She stood and took his hand, pulling him to his feet. She led him to the bank of the crystal clear stream. "Look," she said. He looked into the water. It was not the Acheron, filled with screaming faces. This was the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. "The final step for souls entering Elysium," she explained. "We drink from this water, and the pains of our former lives are washed away. We forget the grief, the fear, the anger. We retain the love, the joy, the goodness, but the wounds are healed forever. I have not yet drunk from it. I was waiting. I think my soul knew you were coming. It wanted to remember you, to say goodbye." The full, tragic weight of his quest crashed down upon him. He had not come to save her. He had come to lose her a second time. This was the climax of his journey. Not a battle with a monster or a god, but a moment of impossible choice and heartbreaking acceptance. "Then I will stay," he said, his voice breaking. "I will die here, and my shade will stay with you." Lyra shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "No, your time has not come. You have a life to live, a debt to pay to Valerius. If you do not, your shade will never find its way to these fields. It will be chained to the world by hatred and wander the grey wastes forever. You must go back. You must live. And when your time comes, naturally, and with your soul at peace, I will be waiting for you here." She leaned forward, and kissed him. Her lips were cool, insubstantial, but he felt the kiss in the deepest part of his soul. It was a kiss of farewell, of love, and of release. "Go, my Centurion," she whispered. "Live for both of us, find peace, and then come home." She turned, walked to the river Lethe, knelt and cupped the clear, sparkling water in her hands. She looked at him one last time, a look of infinite love and finality. Then she drank. As the water touched her lips, a soft light enveloped her. The memory of her mortal sorrows dissolved. The sadness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a pure, untroubled bliss. She still recognized him, but the man she saw was no longer a source of shared tragedy, but a fond, distant memory of a love that was. She was free. Cassius stood alone on the bank of the river, the golden bow, feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He had succeeded. He had found her. He had spoken to her. He had ensured her soul was at peace. And in doing so, he had lost everything all over again. The climax of his quest was not a victory, but a surrender to the laws of life and death, and to the will of the woman he